Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming this evening. This is, as you know, a lecture in honor of Geoffrey Brennan. Geoffrey spent a good part of his career in Australia, but starting in 2005, he made a pilgrimage every year for a semester to take up a position made possible by the provosts at Duke and at UNC. He was a professor in the philosophy department at UNC and a professor in the political science department at Duke, and by training, a world-famous economist. His arrival occasioned and made possible the creation of what was initially a robustly Duke UNC PPE program. But the robustness of the programs grew so much that the collaboration started to be unfeasible because we couldn't get the Robertson Foundation to provide extra buses so that students who were taking the co-convened courses could go campus to campus. So it's now more a partnership than it was at the time a joint program. But the inspiration, the structure, the intellectual focus and the pedagogical focus of the PPE programs bear the very strong fingerprints, the very distinctive fingerprints of Geoff Brennan. He was an extraordinary academic intellectual, an extraordinary singer, an extraordinary golfer, an extraordinary good friend and co-conspirator. The PPE program is the product of the co-conspiracy. He was planning to be here this fall and then found out that he had leukemia. It was a very fast-acting leukemia, and he faced a very challenging decision of what kind of treatments to undergo. And in the course of thinking about this, he came to the conclusion that for him, the right choice was to spend as much time as he could doing what he loves, which is trying to work out ideas that matter to him. Among the things he had arranged for this fall that he was going to come to is something that's characteristic of him, a PPE and literature workshop. This is an annual event that he put on that combines PPE thinking, philosophy, politics, and economics, and literature. This fall, the two books are Adam Smith's A Theory of Moral Sentiments and Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. In preparation for this, he wrote a piece on Adam Smith on the shaping of attitudes and death. And in that essay, he wrote the following, having gone through Adam Smith's account of our attitudes towards death. He wrote, quote, "I find in myself no fear of death as such. If there is a lot of pain towards the end, I won't like it. But I am confident that medical attitudes and practice are such that they will ensure I am, quote, kept comfortable. It's an upshot of my own preferences." This isn't a dicta for everybody, but it's an upshot of my own preferences that if time and pain turn out to be complements, I would prefer to have less of both. As to his life and its termination, he wrote, quote, "I feel mostly an intense gratitude to all those people across a pretty wide spectrum, family, academics, music, who have fallen in with my whims, bent their time and effort and will toward the pursuit of my projects. To say that after 60 years of that, I should have more of it, that 60 years is not sufficient, and maybe another 5 or so might be fun, seems simply ungracious. So he decided that what he would do is not go through the most aggressive treatments that would keep him constantly just trying to stay alive a little bit longer, and go through milder, less robust efforts to preserve his capacity so long as he had it, to think and write. This is so emblematic of how he approached pretty much everything in life. He came to it, he saw what was interesting in it, and he tried to appreciate it and engage with it. It's made him a remarkable teacher, a remarkable scholar, a remarkable colleague, and a remarkable friend. When he died at the end of July, having been writing 2 days before, we had over an hour's discussion of a piece he had sent me 2.5 days earlier. His having died made me think we should do something in his honor, which is in his spirit. And I reached out to a good friend, longtime colleague, and co-author, Philip Pettit, to see whether he might be willing to do something in Jeff's honor. And he said, absolutely, without hesitation. What can I do? When can I do it? I'll be there. What Philip is here to do, let me tell you a little bit about Philip. Philip is the Lawrence Rockefeller University Professor of Politics and Human Values at Princeton University, but also has a long-time continuing appointment at the Australian National University, where he and Jeff both were full-time for a long time together. He is the co-author with Geoffrey Brennan, probably most significantly, of The Economy of Esteem, which is a hugely influential book designed to explore the ways in which you can explain key elements of human behavior, not by direct appeal to interest, but by their concern for esteem. Not just for getting it, but as Adam Smith emphasizes, for meriting it, for it being something you deserve. And this role of esteem in social life makes a huge difference on many fronts, as they argue in their book. Philip Pettit is also really world famous for his development of a particular form of republicanism, which is not a democratic party, but a view of how to constitute a political community so that those within it are free. And this requires a kind of protection from exploitation and oppression and control that depends on careful planning. His work in this area, I discovered with my son, when my son first met Philip, had real-world applications. Most notably, but certainly not exclusively, in Spain, where my son met him right after Philip had come back from Spain, having served as a consultant to see how well they had done in, for instance, making their press a genuinely free press. In Spain, before the prime minister had taken up republicanism, their national news was just a puppet branch of the government. And I know from Philip at the time, years ago, that this was kind of a scary thing to discover, that the theory he had written as a philosopher was being put into practice. And he warned the prime minister, look, whatever you do, you're going to get horrible blowback because of it. This free press is going to be one of your greatest enemies going forward. Fortunately, as a philosopher, he noted, I don't get that kind of blowback. Now, depending on what he says, maybe you all should give him some blowback. We'll see. But his talk this evening is designed exactly in the spirit that Jeff would want it to be. He and Jeff worked on the normative status of social norms, and they didn't agree on how to understand it or think it through. And the bulk of Philip's talk today is his current thinking about how they best could do that. what the best account of understanding the normative standing of social norms. So would you please join me in welcoming Philip Pettit, who's here to speak in honor of Jeff, by engaging with the ideas Jeff cared so much about.
It's a wonderful pleasure to be introduced by Jeff McCord, but it's always difficult to follow him to get the brio. It's a very sad occasion. I'm really sad that it was necessary, so to speak, that it was came about as it did, because Jeff Brennan was a dear friend of and colleague of mine over many years, as he was I know, a very dear colleague and friend of so many people in Duke and in UNC. I'm not going to talk about Jeff's personal qualities or what he meant to me, which was enormous. I've done that actually in other situations, and Jeff McCord has spoken so eloquently about that it's not necessary anyhow. But the best philosophical tribute to a philosopher is always to challenge them within the philosophical dimension. And that's the highest tribute you can pay, really, is that someone's views are worth taking seriously. Jeff and I, when we wrote this book that Jeff McCord mentioned, which was called The Economy of Esteem, we defended a theory of norms, which was, broadly speaking, I know that word sounds like a bad word these days, reductionist, certainly naturalistic theory of norms. And Jeff, in later years, began to back off. I always felt in Jeff, actually, for those of you who knew him, there was the economist, always wanting to do it in nuts and bolts, explain, what's going on here. And then there was a very religious man, for whom things mattered in that quite different register. This was Jeff, who was the great singer, who led many choirs, versus the Jeff, who was tough and wanted to get down to the nuts and bolts. And I always felt they battled a little bit within his personality. I think I maybe won this side of him in that book, or found that side of him in our book about norms, that dealt with norms among other things. I think that maybe the other side came back, so to speak, against me. And indeed, very shortly before he took ill, it was my period of the year at the ANU, I brought this up. The last conversation we had within the university, we had some others afterwards in the hospital, but was about this issue. And I said, we have to talk this out, Jeff. I'm really not convinced anyhow. That's by way of background. This is in memory of Jeff Brennan, our dear friend. It's not on my part to do it, I suppose, but I certainly dedicate the effort to him. And I'm so pleased that Duke and UNC and Jeff McCord and the PBE program have created this occasion. I'm also deeply honored to be invited to do it, so thank you all very much. Okay, so let me just get into the meat of the talk, some philosophy. You all have, I take it, a handout which at least gives you the structure of what I'm going to say. So let me begin by saying that in that book, as I mentioned, we offered this theory of norms that Geoff Brennan lost faith in. And he lost faith in these grounds. The theory of norms, we offered a claim that you could fully understand how norms would arise, social norms. Now, what I mean by that is, we talk about moral norms, meaning moral ideals. By social norms here, what we meant, Jeff and I, and what I mean today, are the sorts of practices that are actually established in a society. Practices of respect, but also practices as trivial as standing at a certain distance from the person that you're talking to. Practices of saying professor or not saying professor to your faculty members, whatever the practice may be, that varies already between universities and countries, certainly. These are what I mean by social norms, that's all. the question is, how do such norms get established? And of course, there's a tradition, sociological tradition, that says that they're basically primitive. You know, you start with norms and start explaining things in terms of norms. And then there's the more, I would say, philosophical and economic approach, which will say, no, you've got to explain what norms are in more basic terms. And that's what he and I were trying to do. And I thought we did quite well in that book. But as I say, Geoff came to have second thoughts. And the second thoughts were this: he thought that in our account, and in, I should say, most of the accounts you get in the literature, and there are many others, ours was not all that different, but certainly complementary to others in the literature, well-known ones. But in what he came to, in our account, the basic terms which you explained why norms would arise, what norms were, what role they played, were really terms of, let's say, prudence, of interest. People's interest in their own welfare, given they're social creatures who interact with one another, are going to give rise to norms of this kind. That's what we argued. What Geoff came to think was that in order to understand what a social norm was, you had to have a more basic idea of what it was to find something normative, meaning to find something speaking to you and saying you ought to behave this way, you know, as if that's not something because it's prudential, it's in your interest. It's just, it's a fundamental, irreducible ought. And he began to feel that you really needed to introduce that. I'm not persuaded. And what I talk today will do is this. Basically, it's in two main parts. One looks at an account that broadly fits with what we offered in the economy of esteem, though it's somewhat different, I should say. And then the second part seeks to explain how the normative, and I would love to be able to persuade Geoff, never got the chance to try, that the normative can actually find a home within this approach too. Okay, so the approach I'm going to take is often described nowadays as a genealogical one. And this is, of course, you all probably know Nietzsche's genealogy of morals, which is a very debunking genealogy. You would think of what it does. It says, this is a story about how morals could arise. Now, in Nietzsche's account of it, they could arise in such a way that you want to say, it doesn't say much about morals. I think that there is a genealogy of men. There's a long philosophical tradition of arguing that there are genealogies in many areas that don't debunk, but actually show you, wow, what the function of these things are. Let me give you two quick examples to introduce the notion of a genealogy. So one is an example from Herbert Hart, who wrote a now classic book in 1962, I think was published, called The Concept of Law. Probably the most important text in legal philosophy, jurisprudence of the last century or so. And he attacked the problem, well, what is law? How should we think about it? What constitutes law? And he said, well, here's an idea. Let's imagine a society of people exactly like us, in conditions, you know, familiar to humankind. But let's imagine a society where there isn't yet any law. There's no system you could look at and say, yeah, that's a system of law. He does think, interestingly, from our point of view today, that in this society there would be social norms that would be in existence. He doesn't explain why they might arise. That, in a way, is what we're talking about today. He takes it for granted they're there. And then he tells you how law would appear. It's a very simple story. I'll tell it to you very briefly. Many of you know it anyhow. He says, well, look, imagine there are social norms that tell people, you know, they shouldn't be violent to one another, they shouldn't deceive one another, they shouldn't be unfaithful to their promises, they shouldn't steal from one another if they're property conventions. Take norms like that. He imagines that most societies, historically that seems to be right, do have norms like that. And he said, now imagine the difficulties that such a system of norms on their own would create. Well, first of all, he says they'd be quite indeterminate sometimes, these norms. You know, difficulties arise. What exactly is the norm here? Is this case covered by the norm? You know, maybe there's a norm of, let it be free speech or something. But But now, is this a case where someone is abusing someone else in maybe vaguely racial terms or whatever? Is that a case of free speech? Does the norm allow that? So there's indeterminacy of that kind. And he says, in any society like that, they're bound to have some procedure. He calls it a secondary procedure, a secondary rule, over and beyond the social norms, which he calls primary rules. You'd have a procedure developing that would enable these people, when indeterminacies arose that were important to society, to put them right. And that might be involved, well, for example, Iceland, we're told in the Middle Ages, there's someone called the lawgiver, who there was an annual meeting, they called it the thing, I believe, or the all thing. And if there were uncertainties about some of the norms, then this, it was a man apparently who was, in that position. And he was assumed to be old and wise and knew the traditions of the society. He was called on to judge what is the norm in this particular case. Well, now he would be really resolving the first problem of indeterminacy. The second problem, though, is inflexibility. So you have a norm, let's say a norm, you can throw all your refuse in the local river, but then mining develops, or something like that. And that means that people downriver from the people who are mining can no longer let their animals safely use the water in the river. So the norm, though, let's say you put refuse in the river, would be inflexible. It wouldn't change. So you've got to have a way of changing the norm when things. That's what Hart argues. And then finally, of course, and probably most obviously of all, someone says he broke the norm. I want him to put things right. And he says, she says, no, I didn't. And now you've got that sort of inefficiency, he calls that. So indeterminacy, inflexibility, inefficiency. And he thinks that in every such case, almost the society imagines would be rationally brought, not acting collectively, just in terms of ad hoc adjustments, to introduce procedures, like the one I mentioned of the person declaring what the law is of an annual event, procedures that would resolve these issues. And now he says, what would you have then in that society? Well, you'd have primary rules or social norms, and then rules for regulating the application of the social norms in people's lives. And now he says, well, look, doesn't that look awfully like a legal regime? And he argues that, yes, indeed, a system of primary and secondary rules interacting with one another, conjoined with one another in a single system, would actually constitute a legal regime. And now he says, what does that tell us? What does that tell us? Maybe what the law is about is actually clarifying, adjusting, and applying, adjudicating norms that are going to be there in any society. That's what a legal system is. That's what its function is. Okay, that's one example of a genealogy. He's told you an as-if genealogy, a hypothetical genealogy. But notice what he argues is not that it's possible that things could happen like that. What he argues actually is that it's robustly likely that things would happen like that in that sort of society. There's some sort of procedures, very different ones maybe in different societies, some sort of procedures like that would robustly emerge, regardless of contingencies. Didn't have to have a great genius to think out what sorts of procedures to introduce. They'd come about resiliently or robustly. So it's not just a just so story, about how it might have happened. It's a story about how it would likely happen if you didn't have law, and that shows you what law is about. The function is to stabilize a system of norms. Another example many of you will know is David Lewis on convention. For various reasons that he was interested in to do with philosophy of language, he wants to know what is a convention, like the conventions governing our use of words. And he goes back to basics, a phrase that Geoffrey Brennan actually loved. And going back to basics, he says, like Hart, imagine a society that did not have any conventions. And he pictures this as a society where you're moving along a road, maybe on your horse or whatever it is, wherever you're traveling, and someone's coming towards you. Well, do I go left to or how is she going to go? There's a coordination problem. coordination predicament. Or imagine people are greeting one another, you know, and you do get these mix-ups across culture, don't you? And greeting one another, one goes to kiss the other person on the cheek, and the other person goes to bow their head, and you get a clash of head. You know, you want to do the same thing in these cases, to go on the same side of the road, to use the same greeting, and it goes on and on and on. Of course, you use the same sound, the same communicative purpose, which is ultimately what Lewis was concerned with. And then when he argues this, well, look, in almost any society of people like us, in conditions like this, which are human conditions, what you would robustly expect, again, it's robustly likely, that they'd find solutions, perhaps ad hoc here and there, to those sorts of problems. You know, there'd be, let's suppose, a natural maybe disposition. For example, do you smile? How do you indicate that you're friendly? Well, smiling comes very naturally and almost certainly on a biological basis to human beings. So that's going to be obviously a way of doing it. Or there'll be just a precedent, or there'll be some analogous sort of situation, and people will adjust and find ways of solving coordination predicaments. And then he tells us how this would become a regularity and recognized by people in the society. This is how you say hello, this is the side of the road that you move on, and so on. And he says, now, wouldn't you call those conventions? And what has he told you by means of the genealogy? He's directed you to, plausibly, the functions that conventions would play in that imagined society, but also, plausibly, that they play amongst us. That's what a genealogy is. Now, what I want to do in two phases is to give you a genealogy of norms, of social norms. In particular, of social norms which are collectively beneficial, and those are the kinds Jeff and I were focused on, and people generally focus on. And I mean by those norms like norms of non-violence, non-aggression, non-deceitfulness, non-fraudulence, norms of fidelity to promises, and so on. The familiar sorts of building blocks of almost any society. These norms have an interesting feature, which is unlike laws, norms that get to be made into laws, but unlike laws, they're not backed up by penalties of a very specific sort. Like having to pay compensation or do community service or go to prison or whatever. There's no penalty like that in place. The other feature, though, is that unlike conventions, they're pretty burdensome. You know, it isn't a burden on any of us to go on the right-hand side of the road, say in America. It's just as easy as going on the left-hand side of the road. So you just want to do what other people do. So if it becomes clear to people what others are doing, they're going to do it. No issue. But when it comes to telling the truth, or not deceiving someone, or keeping a promise, or not being aggressive, or whatever it might be, or not stealing, well, we're well aware there's a burden here. That's why there's a free riding problem, as we call it. Because there's a sense in which self-interest would be better served if everybody else told the truth, but you got away with the opportunistic lie. Everybody else respected property, but you got away with the opportunistic bit of theft, and so on. There's more of a question with norms, if we understand them that way, collectively beneficial but individually burdensome norms. There's a bigger question: why would they get going so automatically, as for example, conventions? Okay, so let me give you the first phase genealogy, I call it in the handout. The first stage, genealogy of social norms, the first stage. First thing to notice is that if you assume that human beings, and I do assume, are mutually dependent, they depend very much on, they rely very much on other people helping them out in various ways or not obstructing them. We're that sorts of creatures. Actually, I see Mike Tomasello in the audience. I remember him arguing in one of his books that, from 400,000 years ago to 100,000 years ago, we as a species basically were obligate foragers, I think was the phrase he used, meaning we basically lived together or died alone. you had to get together. Now, we're very basically, in that sense, a species that depend on one another's, rely on one another's help and non-malevolence, benevolence and absence of malevolence. Okay, now, to that extent, I'm going to want other people to tell me the truth, other people to be non-violent, other people to help me out of this or that difficulty, other people to keep their promises to me, other people to respect my property, if there are property conventions and so on. So I've got to be able to rely on them. And of course, if I want to do something that requires their help, I've got to be able to get them to rely on me in turn. But now, it doesn't take a lot of reasoning or calculation to reckon that if I'm going to get those people to rely on me, I guess I'd better prove myself pretty reliable in response. So now just think of the first person. Here am I, dealing with now, one person, now the second person, now the third person, in recurrent sorts of interactions as you're going to get in most societies, certainly any small society. Let's stick with that for the moment. In such a situation, it's going to be pretty clear to me that if I depend on Jones in a later period, say, being nice to me, telling the truth and so on, I better tell the truth to him. Because if I do not tell the truth to him, for example, it's going to be clear to him that I'm sort of a difficult person to get along with. He better off stay out of my way than get involved with me in any sense. And that's going to punish me, because now here's someone I can't rely on anymore. So I realized quickly, if I'm going to be able to rely on Jones, I'd better prove reliable to him. That's not just true with me and Jones, it's true with me and everybody else. And of course, it's also true for everyone else too, that they've got to prove reliable in the dimensions where they want to be able to rely on other people. They've got to show that other people can rely on them. It's the most basic form, in a way, of the golden rule. Okay, just stick with me in a moment. There's me and Jones, or me and anybody else. There are two other forces that are really going to help along this push to prove reliable in dealing with this or that or another person. The second one is that, well, maybe I'm not going to see this person much again, I reckon. Maybe I'm leaving the area, or maybe he or she is leaving the area. But what I realize is that other people are going to see, likelihood, they're going to be witnesses to how I treat that person. But then those other people are going to say, geez, you better watch out, that guy Pettit, he just told lies, he broke his promises, he told, they're going to think badly of me. So I have to be careful about all of those witnesses too, because even if I'm not going to be meeting Jones again, I'm likely to be meeting some of them. I better, keep my... And then I realized even further, the second booster, that, people gossip a lot. They talk about, there'll be people who witness what I did, or whom I let down, Jones and so on, others, who are not just going to be hostile towards me, they're going to tell other people, you know what that did to me yesterday? They're going to tell the story. You might say, well, why would you expect them to do that? Well, here's one reason. By virtue of saying, Pettit behaved like that, can you believe it? It's virtue signaling, isn't it? They're sort of saying, well, I wouldn't behave like that. So they're saying to other people, you can rely on me. I'm the sort of person who criticizes that sort of behavior, right? And so there's going to be a motive to gossip as well. Now, I take it that in view of this is really still first stage genealogy, first step in that stage. I'm going to adjust with Jones and with other people I basically interact with to prove pretty generally reliable. I mean, I may give in to the temptation, it may even be rational occasionally to let someone down. I think we can get away with it, no one notices, no one's going to talk about it. But in general, I better prove pretty reliable. I've got to adjust in my behavior towards them. But then I realize, okay, that's first step. Second step in this first stage is I'm not special. So Jones and the other people in the society are each going to be in the same predicament. And each of them is going to equally recognize, it doesn't require an act of genius, an insight of genius, that they had better be proof reliable in dealing with other people as well, or they're not going to be able to get other people to rely on them, and they're not going to be able to rely on other people. Okay, so at this stage now, you get to the second step, which is that each of us is going to adjust in dealing with others so that we get into the habit of being reliable, let's call it. But now the second step, of course, is that's going to become a regularity across the society, isn't it? Because almost everybody's going to do that in interacting with other people. Third step in this first stage, not only is that going to become a regular adjustment that everybody makes, whereby everybody proves reliable, in general, I should say, that's also going to be recognized by everybody. It's going to be pretty clear to all of us that around here, we tend to tell the truth, keep promises, not steal property, and so on. It's going to be recognized, in fact, as a matter of common awareness, as is often put. Meaning that I'm going to recognize, hey, everyone does that. But I'm also going to recognize that's evident to me. But not only is it evident to me, it's also evident to other people. And it's evidently evident to other people, as it's evidently evident to me. So that not only am I going to recognize that, hey, this is how people behave around here, I'm also going to recognize that other people, that everybody recognizes that that's how everybody behaves around here. And so on for those of you who are adept at this, in the usual hierarchy of common knowledge, common belief. So it's going to get established as a matter, I'll call it, of common recognition. So now we've got A, adjustment, R, a regularity, second R, a recognition of the regularity. And now I'm going to give you a final and fourth R in this first stage of the genealogy. It's the final step, fourth step in that first stage, which is this. Suppose now we're in a society where it's obvious to everyone that there's a regularity of adjusting in this way, proving reliable to other people. Well, that means that I'm going to say I'm dealing with my children, and I'm worried about their welfare. But I'm going to say, listen, you have to tell the truth. You will get hurt if you don't tell the truth. You've got to keep your promises, What was it Polonius said? This above all to thine own self be true, for then thou canst not be false to any man. That's the basics. Okay. So they're going to use this, members of society, in instructing others. Maybe newcomers, maybe their children, whatever. But also, wait a moment, they're going to use it in correcting. Here's someone who told me a lie, and I say, you can't do that. We all know there's a regularity. You broke the regularity. Okay, so this final R is the R of regulation. Where regulation may be instructive, as in instructing your children or friends or whatever. Or it may be corrective, as in, just making clear to someone what exactly they've done when they've offended against you. So you might think, and that is in a way not so very different from what Geoff and I spelled out in that earlier book. You've got a social norm, don't you? You've got a regularity of behavior which is sustained in the society on the basis of everyone is interested in their own reputation. That was the first stage, in a way. Their own esteem, hence the economy of esteem. And this regularity is a matter of common recognition in the society, and it's invoked by people in regulating one another, that's to say, in instruction and correction. So it sounds like a social norm is born, And it does sound pretty good. I actually think that's a fairly standard story in a way, or a version of a standard enough story, and I think it is worth going through. But there is a problem with it, and I take it that this is the problem that really bothered Geoff, though he never put it exactly like this to me. And the problem is this: someone says to you, okay, so why do you think I should do this? And I've been instructing or correcting, whatever, and I say, well, look, mate, you're in trouble if you don't do this. It's in your own interest. So basically, the reason, so to speak, you ought to do it is a prudential reason. You ought to do it. Everyone ought to do it. Everyone ought to prove reliable in respect of these social regularities, because otherwise they suffer. What I'm doing really, the reason I'm giving this story, when I regulate other people, I'm really counseling them for their own interest. Hobbes has a very nice way of putting that, Thomas Hobbes. He says, and I have it in the handout, counsel is where a man says, do or do not do this, and deduces his reasons from the benefit that arrives by it to him to whom he says it. In other words, do this, do not do this, because otherwise you'll be in trouble. Right? And of course, I might do that in either of two ways. I might say it to my child, you know, like Polonius says to Laertes, right? And, you know, look after yourself, you know, and otherwise, I'm with you, but you're not going to do well unless you stick with these. But equally, if I say to someone, you do not do that, you know, there's a rule and so on, where it would hurt me, then I'm saying to him, it'll hurt you. That's why I should not do it, because here I am threatening you, as were with the response. Now, you might think, fair enough, okay, we're saying it's a social norm, but actually the only reason you should really abide by it that I'm offering you, or anybody's offering you, is a prudential reason. It's in your self-interest. It's prudentially rational. And that may sound like small beer, so to speak. So it's a very English expression, isn't it? It may sound like it's no big deal, right? Why do you call it a social norm? You're really not talking about norms, you're just talking about what's in people's rational self-interest. Okay, so I now think, and I'm going to move to the second stage of the second stage genealogy, I now think that there is a way in which you can get out of this charge, as it were, that norms just become prudential, a matter of counsel. And to do that, I'm going to introduce you to another four-step genealogy. And the first one was A, adjustment, regularity, recognition, and regulation. The second stage is going to be I, as you'll see in a moment. And I is going to be internalization. And I'll leave the other three R's for the moment. Let me tell you about internalization. Now, if you have these collectively beneficial norms in a society, established by the first stage, so to speak, that's imagined in this society, we're doing genealogy, we're talking about this kind of factual society. Okay, now, if you've got those established in that society, then not only is everyone going to want to conform for their own good, but also everyone's going to want everybody else to conform too, because that's also for their own good. They want to, for potential reasons, tell the truth, not lie, not steal, and so on. But they're also going to want other people not to lie, not to steal, because they are going to get hurt, or maybe their friends or whatever, if other people behave like that. So it's going to be the case that not only will everybody want to conform to these, well, let's call them norms, or norms one if you wanted, the norms of the first genealogy, but everyone's going to want that everybody else conforms as well. Everyone's going to want conformity to be general. That is to say, the norm is going to be, and I'm using this word close to how it's used elsewhere in the literature, but not exactly the same. I'm going to say the norm is internalized by people once they come to want not just that they do it, but that everybody else conforms as well. Sort of not very gripping notion, but it will become gripping when I give you a toy example. It's actually from a piece of psychological research done in the 90s in Princeton by Miller and Prentice, for those of you who are interested in the literature. And they did a research, and I'm not going to tell you exactly that scenario, but it was with students who formed drinking groups, who went drinking to the local pub or whatever, in these groups. Because there were reports that these groups, people were drinking a lot of alcohol, and it was a bit of a problem. And they thought they'd look at it psychologically. So it turned out they discovered the following. In many of these groups, everybody, people generally thought that they all drank too much. Every member of the group thought that members of the group drank too much. I asked, well, why do you keep on drinking this much then? They all said, well, other people expect you to drink that much. They basically are saying other people disapprove of you unless you drink that much, X number of pints or whatever, the glasses or whatever you want to call them. You've got to do this or, you're on the outer. That's to say that reputational reasons are leading them to do something they don't themselves want to do because they think that other people expect them to do it and want them to do it. But it turns out that everybody thought that. So it was based on an error on the part of everyone that this regularity grew up. People drinking, let's say 5 pints a night or whatever it might be when they went drinking. And that just came about on the basis of a mistake. What actually the Lord Apprentice called pluralistic ignorance. It was ignorance on the part of each that led them to behave in a way that no one wanted to behave and to establish a norm that no one wanted to be there, but that was there, so to speak, as a byproduct of their individually not wanting to be treated as, what do we say, wusses or, not one of the gang. Okay, now that's a norm that people did not internalize. Because in that group, it's not the case that everyone would have wanted, not just that they drink 5 pints, they didn't actually want that, but that everybody else does as well. In fact, by their individual testimony, each would much prefer if no one drank that much, if each drank just as much as they liked, or if they each drank a lesser amount than what they habitually did. Now, by contrast with that sort of regularity, a regularity of telling the truth, not being aggressive, being faithful to promises, not stealing, a regularity like that is one that is going to be internalized. Everyone wants everybody to abide by it. First step. Second step. It's going to be pretty clear to everybody. It's going to be evident to everybody. And of course, evidently evident to everybody, and evidently evident to everybody, that, hey, we all internalize this norm. It's going to be recognized, the second R in this case is recognition. It's going to be recognized that the norm is internalized in this group. Okay, that's a big step now, isn't it? Not only do people know that everybody conforms, that was in stage 1, but they all know that everybody wants that everybody conforms. Everybody internalizes it in that sense. Okay, now to the second R in this stage. The second R is regulation. Now this is slightly difficult, and I'm going to do it probably more quickly than I ought to, but here's how it goes. Suppose we're in this society where, I know that everybody wants everybody to conform. Everybody internalizes this norm, save truth-telling. And now here is someone who's just been found to tell a lie. Now, I could say to them in the prudential way, you really oughtn't to do that and hurt you. But I can also do something else. Knowing that no one's going to contradict me, I can say, we disapprove, we, including everybody else. I can put myself forward as an authority almost, a spokesperson for the group. Speaking for them, I'm going to say, we disapprove of that. I'm just going to say, that is not the way to behave, or that's not how we do things around here, right? And it's going to be a very different sort of injunction from, it's in your own interest to do this. It's saying, we require you not to do this. And of course, nobody's going to say, well, do we really think that? No one's going to go up. That wonderful scene in The Life of Brian, a film that everybody should see at some stage in their lives. The wonderful scene where John Cleese is playing the leader of the Galilean People's Front or something it's called, and he says, what have the Romans done for us? The Romans have done nothing for us, claiming to speak for everybody. And go, well, there is the roads. Objection, you see. And he said, well, apart from the roads, the Romans have done nothing for us. well, there is the hospitals, the second person says. And that's a case of he's aspiring to speak for the group, and they keep contradicting him. Now, when someone says, we don't tell lies around here, or lying is out, we don't stand for it or whatever, aspiring to speak for the group, no one's going to contradict. If it's a matter of common recognition, that actually everybody internalizes this norm anyhow. And so you can see how there's a big shift. Now the final R, so you get internalization, recognized, internalization, recognized, and then used in regulation, because now the parent will say to the child, you don't do that. Maybe add the prudential stuff, but they can say, that's just not how it's done. Or they can say, correcting someone, not, you're in for it if you do that, or you're in trouble. But they can say, that is not, again, how it's done. That is wrong, so to speak, around here, when you speak of the society. That's the third R. Sorry, that's the second R. The third R is that not only can anybody rebuke offenders, so to speak, without fear of contradiction in the name of the group, it's also going to be recognized as a matter of common awareness across the group that that's the case. This is the sort of norm each will recognize, that anyone can correct others for breaching and correct them in the name of the group. And that's to say, isn't it, in effect, hey, this is a norm that is socially ratified. This has the authority of the group behind it. This isn't just a maxim of prudence. This is something that we all stand behind. I said that Hobbes picks out the prudential stuff very nicely in the notion of counsel. When he says counsel is where he says do it or don't do it, do it not, because it's in your interest. The reasons are it'll hurt you. He contrasts that with command, as he calls it. And I have that somewhere in the handout, yes. A command, he says, is where a man says, do this or do not do this, without expecting any other reason than the will of him that says it. In other words, because I say it, you don't do it. I'm telling you not to do it because it's in your interest, not to do it or to do it. I'm telling you to do it or not to do it because that's the way it is. I'm giving you a command. Now, in the story I've just told, when I say to someone, you don't do that, this is not how we do things, that's wrong, or don't do it, I'm speaking for the community. And basically, I'm giving a command in the community's name. And it's recognized within the community that anybody can do this. Anybody is licensed or entitled to do it. Anybody can do it without fear of contradiction. Now, at that point, I say, you get something very different from the prudential sort of norm that you had at the end of the first stage of genealogy. At this point, you're imagining a society where there are norms established in the group that really are treated as authoritative by members of the group. For members, of course, only. Yeats has a wonderful phrase in one of his poems where he talks about, I must lie down where all ladders start in the foul rag and bone shop of the heart. It's a poem of despair when his themes, he calls them his circus animals, are just not coming back to him. He can't write his poetry. I must lie down where all ladders start in the foul rag and bone shop of the heart. It seems to me the first stage of genealogy sort of tries to generate norms out of the foul rag and bone shop of prudence, as it were, self-interest. But once you add this, you introduce a ladder that you can climb out of, so to speak, the rag and bone shop. When you introduce the notion of it's being assumed by the community as a norm is internalized, recognize that it's internalized, used in regulation where people speak for the community, and when it's recognized that it's that sort of norm that anyone can, so to speak, invoke in correction or in instruction. Now at that point, I think you've got to a norm that has something like normative clout. I think Jeff might have felt of our earlier account that it left norms without that normative clout, because now they only had the clout or the force of sort of prudential advice, a maxim, for your own good. But now they've suddenly become things you should do, not for prudential reasons, things you should do, period, pumped. That's it, nothing more to say. So that's really, there are some other thoughts that I might have introduced in the last section, and the handout may indicate them to you. I'll just say like one of the points, which is that this is not the ought or the should or the normative force that norms gain on this account. Really is a social force. It's not yet a moral force. If you say that something morally ought to happen, is you mean to say, no matter what the society, any society in the world, so to speak, this is what ought to be the case. That's another stage beyond. But I think it's really important for us. Of course, most of the things that are, let's say, morally ought to happen, as we say, before you get to morality, you already have the social demand that we make on one another when we say, this is how we do things around here. Okay, so Geoff Brennan, I would love to have shared this argument with you and to have heard you come back. I'm sorry to have the last word, in a way, on this topic, at least in our exchange, which went on for many, many years. But not I won't have the last word in the wider community to which he and I, we all belong. Thank you very much.